We left off right about here in a book made by Smithsonian, The American Revolution, Visual History. I made a video on Facebook, but here I go. The few large cities were home to about 10% of the colonial population. In 1760, the top 5 were Boston, Charleston, then called Charlestown, New York, Newport, and Philadelphia. Cities around major seaports acted as entry points to the New World from Britain and had the largest concentration of middling classes, who were enjoying increasing wealth. As part of the British mercantile system, imports and exports to Britain and its colonies were constant. Farmers growing crops for local and family consumption would sell the surplus to raise funds for buying British and West Indian imports, such as textiles, homewares, and luxuries. Not everyone could afford these luxuries. A minority of the colonial population, the hardiest colonists, lived on the western frontier in the back country, close to the wilderness, and regularly encountering Native American threats. They led very different, often less prosperous, and much harsher lives than those of the city dwellers in the cast. Such variety in experience led to the evolution of diverse local and regional identities. As colonists confronted issues that were unique to their economy, status, or land, in spite of these identities, colonists had one thing in common prior to the War of Independence. They still considered themselves to be British. They were mostly loyal subjects of their king, tied to their motherland by economies. They were mostly loyal subjects of their king, tied to their motherland by economy, government, friendship, and blood. Little luxury. The colonists enjoyed hot chocolate served with a long-handled pot, sometimes made from copper. The low duties enjoyed by the colonists made this drink affordable. The 13 colonists were parochial, with distinct perspective. The colonies communicated with each other only on limited a limited basis. It's like church-like. That's what parochial means. Building a union. Unified approaches to challenge were rare, even against the French and Indian threats. However, after 1763, the debate over taxation with Britain would breed a spirit of cooperation previously believed to be impossible. Such communities of purpose would lead to the First Continental Congress of 1774, and later the creation of Standing Continental Army. Eventually, the 13 colonies would declare themselves to be independent nation. An independent nation. I like recording so people don't think that I'm making up the words. If I say something and they see that if I break the context and they see that I'm breaking context because I have the words there. Imperial dominance. The 18th century was a time of shifting diplomatic relationships in Europe. Wars rarely fought between two single belligerents and often about succession. Pitted alliances of multiple European nations against each other. Britain and France were always in opposing sides. Both countries were empires with colonial possession across the known world and long-standing North American territories. Britain had the 13 colonies. While Canada and Louisiana belonged to France, the European colonies had been taken by force or by agreement from the Native American settlers. Let's look at the pictures, you know. I will read history to the public because I do not fear death. In 1754, simmering tensions between Britain and France in America erupted in the French and Indian War, which escalated into a worldwide conflict known in Europe as the 7 Year War, as the 7 Years' War from 1756. The major source of the tension was disputed land in the Ohio River Valley, which was largely settled by Native Americans. British colonists generally wanted to increase the security of the frontiers by pushing west with further settlements, while settlers in French territories in modern-day Canada sought expanded trade, not land as basis for control. Native Americans were not united in their allegiances. The most influential alliance, the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, mostly allied themselves with the British, with whom they had a relationship dating back to the early 17th century, formalized in a treaty known as the Covenant Chain. Other nations, mostly enemies of the Iroquois people, chose to side with the French. Native American leaders chose carefully when deciding which side to align with, and when they had balance, Native American leaders choose carefully when deciding which side to align with, and when they had to balance their increasing dependence upon trade goods against their desire to limit encroachment on their lands. The fatal spark. In 1753, 21-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington was sent to tell the French to evacuate the Ohio country near Lake Erie, where French officials were building forts on lands already claimed by the British. The French refused to leave and over the course of the following year built Fort Duquesne, present-day Pittsburgh. I don't know if I said it right. It's a good word, right? It's a town. Present-day Pittsburgh. Near the strategic confluence. Oh, wait. I gotta go back to the last. The French refused to leave, and over the course of the following years. No. The French refused to leave, and over the course of the following year built Fort Duquesne, present-day Pittsburgh, near the strategic confluence of Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. Washington returned to the Ohio country in May 1754, now with reinforcements, 160 men. Seneca chief Tanagreeson known as Half King and 12 warriors as guides on May 20 oh, and 12 warriors as guides. On May 28th, Washington's party crept up on 35 Frenchmen under the command of Ensign Joseph Coetlan de Villiers de Jumonville. I don't know how to say it. Details remain unclear, but the encounter became... Okay, one second. It's there, so they can read it if they don't understand what I'm saying. Details remain unclear, but the encounter became a bloody and lopsided ambush in which de Jumonville was killed, along with many of his men. Anticipating retribution, Washington withdrew to open ground called Great Meadows and built small fortification. Aptly. In this country, 1,000 men could stop 3,000. Yes, America's a very strong country. Named Fort Necessity, he was right to be cautious. On July 3rd, a force of some 600 French and 100 Native Americans overwhelmed them. Washington surrendered, despite receiving reinforcements after signing a capitulation badly translated from the French in the soaking rain. Without Washington realizing it, the document included a clause placing responsibility for de Jumonville's death on him. This skirmish in the woods was the spark that ignited a new war between Britain and France. War on many fronts. The American colonies were not prepared for war. Military operations were expensive and disruptive. Supplying food and arms to British forces was all problematic. Early British operations fared badly. The defeat and death of Commander-in-Chief Major General Edward Braddock. Conquered stronghold. This engraving amalgamates 3 distinct stages of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the amphibious landing of British forces, their scaling of the cliffs, and arrival of the French troops. So that's what this is. And we know the French troops are the ones in the blue coats, right? I'm not sure. I just know the Britons were the redcoats, right? In battle by the Monongahela River on July 9, 1755 was a devastating blow. By 1756, hostilities had spread worldwide. Britain struggled to allocate resources to North America, the Caribbean, Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and India, and further British defeats followed. A British expedition to Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, foundered, and the French siege of Fort William Henry on Lake George, New York, ended with the garrison's surrender to August 1757. An assault on French-held Fort Carillon, later known as Ticonderoga, also ended in disaster in July 1758 at the same time. The western frontiers of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia saw much bloodshed, resulting from Native American raids. Britain was losing the war. The tide turns. The rise in 1757 of William Pitt the Elder as the principal British strategist began to pay. The rise in 1757 of William Pitt the Elder as the principal British strategist began to pay dividends from August 1758. Pouring money into the conflict, Pitt sent thousands of British regulars to fight and even reimbursed the colonies for the troops they had raised. The French could not match this concentration of land and naval power, and the tide turned in Britain's favor. Both Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario and Fort Louisbourg in distant Nova Scotia fell to the British in August 1758. Fort Duquesne in western Pennsylvania fell in November. On December 4th, British Lieutenant Colonel Henry Boquet held a conference with the Delaware nation in Duquesne, exhorting them to send the French away out of your country. They are restless, mischievous people, and the distributors of your peace. The following year became known as the Annus Mirabilis, miraculous year. For Britain, victorious against France, Horace Walpole The following year became known as Annus Mirabilis, miraculous year for Britain. Victorious against French on several continents, in Parliament, Horace Walpole claimed that our bells are worn threadbare with ringing for victories in North America after months of trying to lure the French forces at Quebec into battle. The British General James Wolfe and his men landed at Lance of Falun in the early hours of September 13 and made their way to the Plains of Abraham to take the fortress of Quebec. Receiving word of the British landing, the Marquis de Montcalm, the French commander, ordered his men to attack. Wolfe's army pushed forward with a close-range discharge of musket fire, and the French army retreated. Both Montcalm and Wolfe were killed in battle. Their victory allowed the British to lay siege to Quebec, which surrendered on September 18, 1759, thereby taking control of Canada. Spain entered the war in 1762, but its alliance with France failed to deliver Portugal, as it had hoped, and led to additional losses around the world. British expeditions went on to end France's influence in India, seize the French Antilles and Spanish Cuba in the Caribbean, and take Spanish Manila in the Philippines. With the British victorious across several continents, Britain, France, and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris with Portuguese agreement on February 10th, 1763. The terms included cession of French territory in North America to Britain, including lands inhabited by Native Americans east of the Mississippi. In October 1763, George III issued a royal proclamation to set out how the territories acquired by the peace treaty with France were to be governed. To particular, it set a boundary along the Appalachian Mountain for the 13 colonies, designating this land as Indian Reserve. Only the British Crown could buy or grant land to west of this line, and the colonists were forbidden from settling there. This was not well received by the colonists. Many, including George Washington, held old grants west of the line and were now in doubt. Military training. The drawing from a French drill manual shows soldiers how to present arms. During the time of the French and Indian War, infantrymen carried flintlock muskets to which they could attach a socket bayonet, allowing the soldiers to charge the enemy when needed. The French and Indian War left victorious Britain with difficult choices to make. The cost of victory. The elimination of the French Empire in North America and acquisition of certain Spanish holdings gave the British the resources to develop even greater economic power. However, Britain's immediate concern was the massive debt incurred in achieving victory. The 13 colonies seemed a natural source of necessary funds. Impact on Native Americans. The French and Indian War changed how Britain dealt with the Native Americans. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Geoffrey Amherst built larger garrisons, allowed fewer trade posts, and treated the Native Americans like a conquered people. The native peoples realized that British rule posed a threat to their lands, while the French had concentrated I lost my place because that kind of poked out right there. I was like, whoa. The French and Indian War changed how Britain dealt with the Native Americans. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Geoffrey Amherst built larger garrisons, allowed fewer raiding posts, and treated the Native Americans like a conquered people. The native people realized that British rule posed a threat to their lands. While the French had concentrated on trading, many British colonists were more eager to expand their land holdings. As a result, within months of the end of the French and Indian War, a confederate of native peoples rose up to drive out the British in a war known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Oh, I didn't know about that. French military map case. Maps were vital for exploration, colonial expansion, and waging war. Battle sites were carefully chosen, with detailed plans drawn up to take advantage of the hills, bridges, rivers, and terrain. It's pretty cool, the Pontiac's Rebellion, you know? Kind of makes me think of Tidman Square. A historical moment that not many people think about. Testing loyalties. The French and Indian War stretched loyalties to new limits. Some British officers, such as Robert Orme, the, the aide-de-camp to British Commander-in-Chief Major General Edward Braddock, were openly disdainful of the American troops who fought alongside them. Many colonists, on the other hand, resented the failures of the British Army to protect them from the effects of war. As indigo plantation pioneer Eliza Pinckney explained to a friend in England, the general had now frequent opportunities of seeing and hearing of the appearance and disposition of the Virginia recruits and companies. Mr. Allen had taken the greatest pain with them, and they performed their evolutions and firings as well as could be expected, but their languid, spiritless, and unsoldier-like appearance, considered with the lowness and ignorance of most of their officers, gave little hopes of their future good behavior. From the Diary of Robert Orme, 1755, published in Winthrop's Sergeant's History of an Expedition, 1856. The Cherokees have become extremely troublesome to us, and Highland troops under Colonel Montgomery sent us by Genl. Amherst have not done much more than exasperated the Indians to move cruel revenge, and they are now about to leave us to the mercy of these barbarians. I hope the good people of England won't give all their superfluous money to French prisoners and to build foreign churches, but reserve some for their poor fellow subjects in America. For if they go on to make new conquests in America and neglect the protection of their old colonies, they may have importations of distressed people from the southernmost part of North America to exercise their charity upon. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, planter to the Honble Mrs. King of Ocham Court, Surrey, England, July 1760. Allies out of control. The French had problems controlling their Native American allies. This engraving shows French commander Louis Joseph de Montcalm, who had agreed to allow the safe withdrawal of British forces falling to stop the Native American fighters under his command from attacking as the British evacuated Fort William Henry in 1757. Women, children, servants, and slaves were all caught up in the massacre. So was that Native Americans massacring the Britons? It's like people forget that how brutal people were back then, and they try to act like they were victims. The bad guys were victims. I'm not saying all Native Americans, I'm just saying people in general in older times. Raising revenue. After the French and Indian War, Parliament had debts to pay, but when the British government introduced the Stamp Act in 1765 to raise revenue, colonial criticism was united. Rational and swift, triggering debate about the legality of taxation without representation. The inhabitants of the 13 colonies were proud of the British, but their relationships with the mother country was put under strain during the French and Indian War. Commercial origins. The 13 colonies had been established in North America for commercial gain. The first Virginia was established in 1607 by a charter granted to the Virginia Company. The colonies were governed by their own assembly, but had no representation in the British House of Commons. Spoils of war. Britain had emerged victorious from the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the conflict in 1763, provided substantial territorial gains for Britain. However, the war with France had been costly and had also angered many American colonists, who felt that the British had failed to protect them after the adverse effects of war fought on colonial soil. George Grenville. Author of the Sugar and Stamp Acts, George Grenville became Prime Minister after more than 20 years in Parliament. His ministry, which began in 1763, was short-lived. Not only did his tax policies upset the colonists, but he was also unpopular at home, clashing with radical John Wilkes over freedoms established in the Bill of Rights, and with the king over the Regency Bill. He was dismissed in July 1765. Grenville never held office again, but supported colonial taxation until his death in 1770. If this be treason, make the most of it. Patrick Henry rousing speech on May 30th, 1765, defending the Virginia resolves. But his criticism of the king had contemporaries crying treason. He soon apologized, professing loyalty to George III. The beautiful picture. I'm not done until I say I'm done. Glory to America. In the course of the French and Indian War, Britain's national debt had roughly doubled from about 72 million in 1756 to well over 130 million in 1763, 15.3 billion to 27.2 billion in today's money. Post-war debt reduction was necessary, and Parliament sought greater administrative and fiscal effectiveness, looking first to Britain itself, then to Ireland, India, the Caribbean, and North America. A source of funds. As the considerable war debts had been incurred in the American colonies, Parliament sought to raise money by taxing the colonists. George Grenville, Prime Minister in April 1763, began with the Sugar Act. Technically, the American Revenue Act, which Parliament approved on April 5, 1764. This replaced the expiring Molasses Act, which customs officials and Royal Navy had already begun to enforce more. This replaced the expiring Molasses Act, which customs officials and the Royal Navy had already begun to enforce more, an increase in the number of peacetime troops in the Americas. 2/3 of these troops would be stationed on the colonies, western frontier, and rest in the Caribbean, all areas vulnerable to French and Spanish encroachment and Native American attacks. The act passed. It is the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them but with their own consent. I am not anti-tax. Do not get it confused. Rigorously, the Sugar Act lowered the tax on foreign molasses with the aim of increasing its collectability, and by extension, the revenue. However, it also included, among other things, a list of goods that could only be exported to Britain. Merchants and traders were required to have detailed shipping documents, subject to strict inspection. Grenville also replaced all absentee customs officials and those prone to accepting bribes with new appointments. The colonists objected strenuously to the Sugar Act. It came at the time of economic depression in the colonies, as lucrative contracts to provide British expeditions with food, supplies, and transportation as had ended. A lucrative contract, er, a, as lucrative contracts to provide British expeditions with food, supplies, and transportation had ended. To make matters worse, the newly appointed customs official initially demonstrated an unprecedented dedication to duty in collecting the new tax. To make matters worse, the newly appointed customs official initially demonstrated an unprecedented dedication to duty in collecting the new tax. Dedication to duty. Not just sugar, it soon transpired that the Sugar Act was only the beginning. The Stamp Act of 1765 was intended to pay for I messed up. I can edit that out. As the considerable war debts had been incurred in the American colonies, Parliament sought to raise money by taxing the colonists. George Grenville, Prime Minister in April 1763, began with the Sugar Act, technically the American Revenue Act, which Parliament approved on April 5, 1764. This replaced the expiring Molasses Act, which custom officials and the Royal Navy had already begun to enforce more. Rigorously, the Sugar Act lowered the tax on foreign molasses with the aim of increasing its collectability, and by extension, the revenue. However, it also included, among other things, a list of goods that could only be exported to Britain. Merchants and traders were required to have detailed shipping documents, subject to strict inspection. Grenville also replaced all absentee customs officials, those prone to accepting bribes, with new appointments. The colonists objected strenuously to the Sugar Act. It came at a time of economic depression in the colonies, as lucrative contracts to provide British expeditions with food, supplies, and transportation had ended. To make matters worse, the newly appointed custom officials initially demonstrated an unprecedented dedication to duty in collecting the new tax. It soon transpired that the Sugar Act was only the beginning. The Stamp Act of 1765 was intended to pay for an increase in the number of peacetime troops in the Americas. 2/3 of these troops would be stationed on the colonies' western frontier. The rest of the Caribbean, all areas vulnerable to French and Spanish encroachment and Native American attacks. The act passed on March 22, 1765, decreed that legal papers, periodicals, and documents would be required to use officially stamped paper from November of that year. The paper must be paid for in British rather than colonial currency. The colonists had been debating early proposals for the Stamp Act since 1764, and its passage caused outrage throughout the territories. Lawyers cited the illegality of taxation without. Ousted by the mob. An effigy of Boston Stamp Act Commission Andrew Oliver was raised on the Liberty Tree in August 1765. The mob beheaded the figure and plastered it with stamps. Within days, Oliver resigned from his post. If you come into our land and you try to control us in a bad way, we will get you. Lawyers cited the illegality of taxation without representation. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed a series of resolves written by Patrick Henry on May 30th, 1765, asserting that only Virginia's own assembly had the right to tax colonists in Virginia, Maryland, and Rhode Island. Soon passed their own resolution to this effect. Meanwhile, from May 1764, Bostonian Samuel Adams became a leading critic on the Stamp Act. After joining the Massachusetts legislature in September 1765, he wrote that act was calculated to enslave and ruin us. In Britain, the American crisis had already contributed to Grenville's departure from office, but in October, colonial leaders decided to come together to discuss a solution. Meeting in New York, the Stamp Act Congress, which included 27 delegates from the colonies, crafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, arguing that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax. The Declaration, arguing that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax. The Declaration was sent to both the King and Parliament. Opposition to the Stamp Act turned into a rallying cry for agitators across the colonies. The Sons of Liberty, comprising concerned citizens from all sections of colonial society, formed in Boston in 1765, meeting secretly in small groups. The organization would grow considerably in the years ahead. Meanwhile, on the streets, reactions to Stamp Act became increasingly violent. The bulk of it centered on the much-hated customs officials. Angry, unruly mobs intimidated local tax commissioners, rendering the officials increasingly ineffective in Boston. For example, protesters hung up an effigy of Governor Hutchinson's brother-in-law, the local Stamp Act commissioner. Not Protestants, no, we're not saying that. I'm gonna edit that out. Protesters cut down the crude effigy and paraded it through the streets, shouting liberty, property, and no stamps before wreaking havoc on the local Stamp Act. I'm going to edit out the part where I said Protestant because it's not what it says. It clearly says right there, protesters. Okay, so the Stamp Act planted a seed of dissent among the colonists. The British ignored these warning signs. So they beheaded somebody and put them on a stake. Oh, stubborn ministries. Although they repealed the Stamp Act, Rockingham's ministry also passed a declaratory act in 1766, asserting the right to Parliament to tax the American colonies. The British tried taxing the colonists in 1767, when a new ministry under William Pitt the Elder introduced the Townshend Act. I gotta say, he was oppressing them. What are you to do in that kind of time? You have to stop the bad guy. Key agitators. For Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, the Stamp Act was only the beginning. They protested the Townshend Acts Their hometown became a hotbed of simmering tension. This would lead to the Boston Massacre in 1770, while the tax on tea led to members of the Sons of Liberty dumping tea in Boston Harbor. In Boston, for example, protesters hung up the effigy of Governor Hutchinson's brother-in-law. The local Stamp Act commissioner protesters cut down the crude effigy and paraded it through the streets, shouting "Liberty, property, and no stamps," before wreaking havoc on the local stamp office. Too little, too late. The Stamp Act, clearly unenforceable, was repealed in March 1776 by the new Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham. Not only had the act generated little revenue, but it had also incited some unprecedented colonial resentment. Yet what most surprised the British was the unity of the opposition. Perplexed as well as thwarted, British officials were back to square one.